Hello, my friends. Welcome. My name is Joe. This is the Joe Martino Show. Today, I want to talk to you about why do we self-censor ourselves? What happens when we do that? And how do we decide if a conversation we had went well or didn't go well? And what might be broken in some of our metrics? And how might we do it better? Let's kick it off. This is the Joe Martino Show. Okay, welcome back. I hope that your day is going well. Wherever your day is, whatever's going on, I hope that the day is going well. I want to talk to you today about how do we decide if we had a good conversation. This is born out of a couple different things. One, I've had a lot of clients write in, I've had a lot of clients where we've had this discussion about like, hey, my wife says I was wrong here because my kids were upset. My wife says I was wrong because she was upset. My husband says I was wrong because when I talked to his mom, she was upset when I was done. And the overarching metric that they're coming to me with is consistently feelings. My feelings were this, the feelings were that, my husband's feelings were that, whatever. And if the feelings are bad, then the conversation went bad. If the feelings were good, then the conversation went well. And this is even with my own family. My wife and I had a conversation. My wife and my daughter and I, one of my daughter's friends thought he was going to like me. He doesn't because he had very strong opinions that were just full of logical fallacies. And I pointed out the logical fallacies, and I don't know, I should bring my wife on maybe. I think they might even say I was mean to him. An idea that I wholly reject. I don't feel that I was mean to him. I pointed out his logical fallacies. I pointed out when he said things that were not accurate or that were based off of something. The one time I actually said to him, I said, that isn't what the person said, because I know that you've actually heard what they said. So I guess that could be mean because essentially I was accusing him of speaking falsehoods. But I believe that he really did say that. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't violate any of the 6 rules of communication. So I'm kind of giving you a little bit of the end of the show right here. And so this has been an interesting conversation for me. How do we decide if what we said was right? Because what we're doing in society isn't working. If you don't believe me, just pick any current hot topic headline issue and listen to both sides talk. Nobody seems to be able to have conversations where they deal with the ideas. No one seems to have any questions about like the content. It's simply, oh, you disagree with me, you're a fascist. And both sides are saying that. Both sides, oh, look at this. Here's the proof that I'm right. And it's around religion. It's around how we should live our lives. It's around politics. It's around the government. If you don't agree with me, you're part of the problem. I've talked about that in the past. I'm not going to talk about that today. I'm literally going to talk about how I feel as though we have swung from one end of the pendulum to the other. And what do we do about that so that we can actually have a society that has productive conversations? And of course, if you know me, you know that this is going to start with this idea of what you said made me feel, right? And you'll hear some version of this, right? Like, oh, hey, listen, I'm not telling you that you're wrong. I'm not saying that you're wrong. I'm just saying how you made me feel. And that's hogwash. I really want to say a stronger word there, but it's just hogwash. Now, you can say, when you said that, this is how I felt. But the problem is, if I can make you feel something, then I'm responsible for your feelings, and I have to change in order for your feelings to change. And I just can't help but wonder, is this part of the reason we are so lonely as a society? Because we outsource our emotions to other people. You made me feel, and then we simultaneously want to avoid anyone who we disagree with. And we engage in what I call small-time cancel culture, right? Like most people aren't trying to cancel someone that they disagree with completely. So let's just say that you strongly believe that ICE, I'll just get right into it, that ICE should be defunded. And you have a friend that you guys agree on about 85% of everything going on. And your friend strongly believes that ICE should get more money. The chances that one of you ends up canceling the other person because you're immoral is incredibly high. Now, you probably don't want them to be canceled completely, like, cancel culture. We don't want anybody to go see so-and-so's movies anymore because he's been convicted of a crime or whatever. But you want to engage in cancel culture of you don't want that person in your life anymore. And so what happens is you create an echo chamber and you never develop the muscle to actually feel bad and engage through the conversation, which becomes very difficult then to have true emotional maturity and true relational maturity. I believe it was Parker Palmer said that there are 4 levels of friendship. And the 4th one, true intimacy, very few people actually come to, because you have to repeatedly go through conflict in order to have that real level of emotional maturity or emotional intimacy. And you have to have emotional maturity to do that. And so how do you engage in disagreements and keep growing, keep developing the friendship? And part of that is because we have this cultural confusion around emotions. We've swung from ignore your feelings to your feelings should rule you. And not only should they rule you, but they should rule the people around you. So if your friend says blah, 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 then, and you don't agree with that, and that makes you feel whatever, then we should stop interacting with that person. We should cancel them, because emotions now, validating emotions, and I talked about this last week, I think it was episode 329. These emotions now drive what we do. So if I feel it, I'm not responsible to step back and ask myself, what do I feel and why do I feel it? All I have to ask myself is, what do I feel and what happened right before I felt that? And whoever did that action, they're bad, and I get to cancel them, at least from my life. So this starts with that idea that other people create our emotions. And then it runs with the idea that we have this broken metric of feelings. Once they become the predominant thing, if that person feels bad, or if I felt bad, if anybody feels bad, something wrong happened. Because if we have good communication, no one should feel bad. So essentially, my wife and my daughter was a little bit, she was like, well, but my wife said, you don't have the relationship with the guy to point out those things. He was a server. He could have walked away at any point. Here's the thing that I'm just going to throw out there. I don't have to have a relationship with someone to say, no, what you're saying isn't truth. And here's the thing, if he doesn't like me today, that's on him. Because I'm happy to sit down and talk with him again. I'm happy to hear where I offended him, but I'm not going to apologize simply because he was offended. And this becomes the result or the cure for the broken metric. So the broken metric is whatever you felt, whether it was you or me, right? So I can be like, well, I don't like him because he didn't hurt my feelings, though. But I'm just going to say that he did, because he hurt my feelings because he talked bad about an institution and about someone whose actions I actually respect. No, not Donald Trump or a politician. It's somebody local. Don't try to figure that out. Right. And so because he disagreed with them and he said falsehoods about them, I'm done talking to him. Like I just wouldn't do that. I would go back there to eat, and I would happily have him as my server. I would still tip him well, because here's the thing, emotional maturity says we can disagree. And that's a much better solution to this broken metric of, well, you felt bad. Because here's the thing, we have switched. When I was younger, if you were offended, it was on you to figure out why you were offended and what part of that you controlled. Maybe not everybody, but the circle that I grew up in, I can say that for sure. Unless you were an outsider, but that's a whole different thing. Right now, what it is anytime I'm offended, it's not on me, it's on you. If you offended me, then you are the one that's the troublemaker, and I need to somehow stop talking to you, or I don't have to talk to you. And we'll dress this up. We'll make this depending on where you're at. There are people that won't do this, but there are a lot of people that will dress this up, and they'll make it a little bit more palatable, and they'll be like, oh no, I was super polite to him. Like I won't say the kid's name because I don't know that he listens. I think some of his friends do. But like, I could be like, oh, well, no, I talked to him. I went to his table and I went to his restaurant and I sat there and blah, 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 blah. Right? But at the end of the day, we're just canceling him because he made me feel bad. And my emotions run everything. Instead of sitting back and asking myself, why does this bother me? Just last night I read something. I was like, those are just lies. Those are not accurate. Now, here's the difference. This was on Facebook that I read it, so I didn't engage. I just scrolled on because I don't believe the impersonal Facebook page is a very good place to have conversations that are going to be emotionally charged. But the things that the person said, like I actually said to my wife, I was like, so here's his 5 basic tenets. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And here's literally, they're all wrong. And I can easily go to sources that he would hold as typically truth-holding sources and disprove his points. Now, if that person and I were having a conversation face-to-face and he made those same things, here's the crux of my conversation today. What responsibility do I have to someone I know to point out, hey, you just said that, and here's some evidence that suggests it isn't true? And we'll say that to varying degrees, right? Because if we're in person, I probably would say, I don't know, dude. I don't think that's accurate. In fact, that right there, that statement right there, I know it isn't accurate because here's the proof, because I lived through what you're referencing there. And so I think there are two important things we have to consider here. One, like, how does that work out? If you know me, you know I'm actually a big fan of social media. I don't think it's going anywhere. So we have to figure out how to use it. I do think this is one of the areas where it has created a situation, like we have words that didn't exist before social media, rage baiting, right? Like this is the person who makes a comment or a statement, not because they're interested in a conversation, just because they want to see people get angry. And those people have always existed, but one of the things that social media has done is it has created an opportunity for them to be able to get more people, get their word in front of more people, right? So we just interact with more people than we would have, say, 40 years ago or 30 years ago, just by virtue of I don't need the geography to go away in order to interact with people. And so in social media, there's a lot more things that happen, a lot more conversations. People don't hold their emotions as well, at least in part probably because there's no one else around them, so they're just on their keyboard, just going to war. Thus the term keyboard warriors, another term that didn't exist before social media. And so we have to ask ourselves, okay, so we got to wrestle with that, right? But then we also have to wrestle with what does that mean for how we interact outside of social media? And one of the things that I think has happened is we have stopped interacting outside of social media over things that we disagree on. We've stopped interacting outside of social media on things. We basically create an echo chamber that runs all the time for us. And part of that is because we've seen, I think, I've done zero research on this, but I do think that this is something. We have run into an issue where we just don't find productive conversations happening much. And so if we need conflict, right? If no one grows without friction, how do we grow if we don't ever have friction in our conversations? And part of that is we're going to have to distinguish between social media and real life. Like there has to be a way, because there are some other things that are going on, right? I don't think that we are teaching people how to handle criticism. We're shaping all feedback as only positive. I used to teach the roast beef sandwich, right? Hey, if you have to give somebody negative feedback, give them the positive, then give them the negative, then give them the positive. Now, most research says that people see through that and they're like, yeah, that's hogwash. I don't want to deal with that. Just give me the negative feedback. And so we have to run that out. What are the unintended consequences both of social media and of how we have handled the problems that come with social media? Are there unintended consequences to I'm just going to scroll on. I think there are, right? I think because one of them is then that becomes a habit. And it also becomes a habit when we engage people that we don't talk to very much. For instance, just here in my community, this guy put up this really weird Facebook post. Two people that I know kind of were like, whoa, wait a second. That's really weird. I don't think that's accurate. And he didn't respond to them. He just deleted them. And, I live in a small town, 4,000 people, I think is our town population. I think that might be high. I don't know how many people live here, but it's not a lot, right? And so when you run that out, what happens then? Does that then bleed into how you interact with people in person? Does that, okay, I'm just going to ignore you and delete you. Does that bleed into how you interact with people who disagree with you when they disagree with you in person? I think it does. And I think this is one of the reasons that the idea that their main emotions or my emotions are the main metric for how we decide if something went right, I think that's one of the reasons that that's so dangerous. The second then I think logical question that comes out of this is, if the main question is how did everybody feel when the conversation was over, we have to sacrifice things. Truth, clarity, responsibility, they all become secondary. And we're seeing this. If someone doesn't do well in school, right, or on a sports team, you're not allowed to say to them, you didn't do well, or it doesn't look like you put a lot of effort into that. Well, that might hurt their feelings. Or, in the situation where I was talking to that kid, okay, wait, you just said this. Do you really believe that was said? Because I can show you the quote. That isn't what was said. I can show you the email. That isn't what was said. Right? Like, you run that out. How do we determine what is the appropriate response and what isn't? How do we determine what is the correct question that we want to have people rustle out? How do you and I determine, did we have a right conversation? I have a conversation with my daughter and I tell her, hey, I don't think that you did your best here. And she gets mad. Did I do it wrong? If my wife says to me, you didn't do this and you said you would, and now I'm mad because I just got called out, did she do it wrong? If I'm mad 2 weeks later, did she do it wrong? Because where I'm living, the world that I inhabit, that is the metric. If a dad goes to his son and says, hey, what you're doing isn't very healthy and it needs to change, and he gets upset, for those of you who are just listening to this, what you don't know is I just counted in my head. I can come up with 5 names of guys that I know or women that I know who have come to me, and one of them has said that that's the conversation that they've had, that they were told they were wrong because their kid was upset. That's gonna be a whole episode down the road. And so that run becomes an issue, because how do we decide if feelings are the measuring board, the measuring stick? How do we decide what's right? Because where I live, I think feelings should be data. This is what you felt, right? So I tell people all the time when they're like, oh, that made me feel. No. In fact, I've got one client who makes fun of me for it right now. Incidentally, actually, it's not the client, it's the client's spouse. But incidentally, this client's spouse also struggles to control their emotions. They also struggle when they get upset to not act like a 3-year-old. So I think that's pretty interesting that they refuse to admit the idea that no one else is responsible for their emotions except them. And here's 2 other things we have to consider. Discomfort does not equal harm, and emotional safety does not equal emotional comfort. When you put all of that together, what happens? Because here's the thing, and no one really that I know of likes to be questioned by what they're doing. I don't like to be questioned. I remember the first time somebody suggested that counseling isn't working, and I was like, that's not true. There's a whole bunch of data to show that it is. And then I had to stop and ask myself, okay, but what about that data? In other words, I had to do an investigation, and I had to ask myself, why does that bother me so much? Right? And there are some good things that run out there like, hey, if somebody that you wouldn't take their advice, why do you care about their criticism? I think that's a fair question. But how do we run this out? Because what are the consequences of this is something we have to consider. And so we have to ask that question. If emotions are the scoreboard, what is the natural consequences of that? And I think the very first one that becomes obvious is that self-censorship becomes the norm. People stop telling the truth and they start managing emotions. And I can't tell you how often I say this. Now look, do we have a responsibility to manage other people's emotions? We have a responsibility, I think, to be kind. We have a responsibility to make sure that what we say is the truth. And we're going to get into those metrics at the end a little bit. But if you've been around for a while, you know that I believe in those 2 things. But the problem is we've gone too far. And if we are kind and we do tell the truth and a person still gets upset, or if they are kind and they do tell the truth to us and we still get upset, we blame them, or they get to blame us. And that's a problem, because then self-censorship becomes the norm. And there's no true intimacy when censorship enters the conversation. There just isn't. Now, is there a way to say it? Yes. But even that we've taken so far that the metric for that becomes how the other person felt. I think another just natural consequence to this is the most reactive person gets to set the rules. And you see this in our society. We're addicted to anger. We're addicted to loud. We're addicted to the loudest voice wins. If you scream the loudest, you're right. And that's not right. That's not accurate. That's not helpful, because what it does is it creates emotions as a leverage. They become a leveraging tool. They're not information. I get to use them to have issues with you, whether you did anything wrong or not. Resentment will then end up replacing honesty. And this one, I struggled. I thought about this as I was writing it down. I was like, is this accurate? Because how much resentment is a choice? And I think if we hang on to resentment, that's a choice. What actually happens is growth stalls, because there can't be growth if we can't have honesty, and relationships die, right? And I see this a lot with Gen X and their parents. I do. I see it a lot with Gen X and their parents. Their parents don't want to listen to a whole lot. And certainly Gen X has their issues too. But their parents don't want to listen like, hey, this happened. And well, I didn't mean to do that. I didn't feel that way. Okay, well, but feeling that way doesn't mean you didn't do it. I thought it was funny. Okay, but you've been told numerous times it wasn't funny. Relationship size. That's one of the ways this runs, right? What happens is relationships become very surface and or they die. And then that's why people are lonely. And I see this in my room. I see it with colleagues. One of the things I had an interesting email come in. Somebody asked me, is there such a thing as a conservative therapist? In other words, I want a therapist that looks somewhat like me. And if you brought this up to a bunch of therapists, probably everybody would be like, well, our views shouldn't impact our therapy. And that's true. I have had clients that I don't agree with almost anything that they believe politically or how life should run. But not every therapist can do that. And the idea of a person wanting a conservative therapist, I think, is interesting to me, because what happens is then you can't have conversations. If you're a conservative, you can only have conversations with the conservative people. Is that the question? And I hope it isn't, but we are kind of getting there. And so I see it there. I see it with my colleagues who are like, well, there's some Facebook groups of professional counselors that I'm a part of. And one of them put up just this week, I had to terminate with a client this week because they were MAGA. Really? Like, honestly, you're a trained professional therapist in theory. You can't meet with somebody that you don't agree with? That's awful. That's just terrible for you. This does bring us, of course, to, okay, well, then what, right? One of my favorite questions is always, so what does something mean and then what? As in, then what are we going to do about it? And I think that this becomes a question, okay, well, what are better metrics? And we've talked about this a lot. Is it true? Is it kind? Is it necessary? Is it helpful? I'm going to actually introduce 5 other questions today that do go around that. And then we're going to kind of talk about what isn't there, and then what does this mean, and what am I not saying? I think that's also an important part of this. I think the first question we have to ask ourselves is, what I said accurate or reasonably grounded? And this is going to be more about feedback, not a contradiction. I recognize that there are people that they're going to just see the same video, they're going to see the same fact, they're going to see the same speech, they're going to watch the same event, and they're going to have different takeaways. And I think that in that case, the reasonably grounded portion of that sentence comes into play, that question comes into play, because what I want to, somewhere I've got to say, okay, look, do we both agree on what we saw? And then we do agree that we just interpret it differently. But if we're actually talking about feedback, is what I said accurate or reasonably grounded? It's just a good place to start. And so at somewhat, this comes down to another societal phenomenon, that you have your truth and I have my truth, and we're both just living our truth. And there is some truth to that. Truth is subjective. I think the bigger question becomes, how much truth is there objective truth? And what does that mean? And here's the thing, even my most ardent friends for the position of there is no objective truth, they express that in a way that says they don't really believe that. They believe in subjective truth or objective truth, even though they're saying they just believe in subjective truth. I think another question is, was it necessary? Now, this would be the one where I think my daughter and my wife would get me, because I was at that kid's work and, he was waiting on us. There was us and another table there, and they probably have some things there that I'd have to consider. in the spirit of being like trying to apply what I'm sharing with you, I probably should consider that. Here's a fun one. Was I speaking from a place that I wanted to care about you, right? Because kindness, you know my definition of kindness if you've been around for a while. Kindness isn't just concerned about how you feel. It's concerned about how you feel to an extent and what's best for you. Or was I speaking from a place of control? So was I speaking from care or control? And this is one that, you got to go around, because I think we can all get to a place where we just dislike the people that repetitively disagree with us, especially if we think that they are using facts or misusing facts. One that gets me is when they misuse emotions. That can drive me nuts when they're using emotional manipulation. Things like, I'm just being honest with you. I just have to be true to myself. This is how I feel, so this is what I need to do. Okay, but what if what you're doing and what you feel brings harm, like literal harm to people, like your kids? Well, I just have to be true to myself. Oh, okay, well, you be true to yourself. Who's going to pay your kid's therapy bill? Well, I just want to throw that out there, right? And you can see, even when I'm given those examples, I violated this next one. Was my tone clear, not contemptuous? Was how I was speaking, was my tone about the conversation, or was it about kind of berating you? And this one can be, I know this one can be a little fuzzy. People's tone is the most dangerous metric for us. Maybe not metric, but it's the most subjective part of the conversation, because tone, when people talk about their tone, I'm like, okay, can you define that? I often get no. Well, if you can't define it, I don't know how to help this person talk better to you with a different tone if you can't tell me what you're looking for. And that creates an issue. Pretty quickly, you will notice what is missing, and that is how are they feeling or how was I feeling is not a deciding factor. It is a data point that we have to consider. And I love the question of why here, right? Okay, so if I was upset with something you told me, you wrote in and said you don't like my podcast. I laugh because I get a lot of funny ones where people don't like my podcast. And if someday I'll just read them to you. They're just funny to me because they're not very articulate about what they don't like. They just kind of don't like me. One woman wrote in and told me I was ugly and stupid. Right, okay, so you don't like it. Well, I like the question, why? You felt some negative emotion there. Why? I felt some negative emotion when you wrote in and told me you don't like my podcast because it was too short or it was too long or I should have another person. Why did I feel that? Because here's the thing. Discomfort alone does not mean damage was done. Discomfort is an invitation to ask myself, why am I feeling the discomfort? Discomfort is an invitation for you, if I'm the one talking to you or someone's talking to you, why do you feel discomfort? Now, you can run it back and be like, okay, so they felt discomfort there and I could have said this differently. And yeah, maybe that's true. Or I could have said, maybe I could have picked a different venue to have that conversation. Or that kind of, maybe somebody, you could take that as an attack. Okay, and I need to rework that. Okay, and we should be doing that regularly. But with what's currently going on, where the minute I feel bad, you are automatically wrong, what happens is we start to then self-regulate, and we're not actually creating intimacy in how we're interacting. And when you can see this in how we're teaching it to our kids, because we're telling our kids that emotional health is validating their emotions. Again, something else I've talked about in the past. But what about emotional health is where we ignore emotions or we just absolutely indulge each one? Neither one of those are healthy. And so what we want to do is we want to recognize our emotions, and then we want to explore the why. We want to acknowledge another person's emotions, and then we want to ask ourselves some of those questions that I just brought up. So here's maybe 3 questions for you to consider as we wrap this up today. What are you not saying because someone might feel something? Where do you see maybe people you care about engaging in behavior that is destructive or hurtful to them, and you're not saying something because you're afraid that they won't react well? Who benefits from your silence? This could be its own episode. Who benefits from your silence? Most often, the reason we self-regulate ourselves, we self-censor ourselves, that's a better word. Most often, the reason we self-censor ourselves and we engage in what I talked about earlier, that small time cancel culture is because we benefit, because then they're not mad at me and I want people to like me. I should just make that a whole episode. And then, are you measuring health, your health and others' health by growth or by comfort? In other words, a lot of people think if their life is uncomfortable, it's because they're not growing. That's not accurate. That's probably the exact opposite of accurate. And so, how do you measure growth in yourself, in your friends, in your relationship with your friends? That's the key one. How do you measure growth in your relationship with your friends? So that's the whole episode today. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope I gave you some things to think about. I hope that in sharing a story where there's actually tension in my family over something, that you see, like, this is not something I just want to talk to you about. It's something that we're living. So that's the whole show today. Thanks so much for listening. We'll catch you next week.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, please share with a friend. And hey, give us that rating in your podcast store. Until next time, change possible.